Hey there. So I wanted to take a quick moment and give a shout out to one of the listeners. One of the folks that helps produce this podcast noticed a comment that was posted by WHEC41. Now, I'm pretty sure that handle is in reference to the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Chautauqua. The Chautauqua was a Owasco, I think that's how you pronounce that too, high-endurance cutter that was named after the Chautauqua Lake in New York. The cutter Chautauqua was actually in the Coast Guard service from 1945 to 1973, or at least that's how long that cutter was in service. It might have been with the Navy for a little while, I don't know. So WHC41 left a really nice comment and an informative one as well. So in Season 1, Episode 6, Inspections and Pootajacks, well, 41, not like the president, but this guy whose name I'm just shortening because saying WHC 41 is, well, it's a lot to say, really, just for like 6 letters. But anyway, so he noticed that I actually spelled the word Pootajack wrong, which isn't to say that it lessened the experience of doing Pootajacks, because it was like a really horrible experience. But regardless, he did help fill in a funny gap in my boot camp knowledge. So I appreciate that. So what you're probably wondering is, what exactly does Pootajacks stand for? Well, first off, I didn't know Pootajacks was actually an acronym for anything. I just thought it was some weird sort of sadistic or perhaps masochistic word that the training team in Cape May made up. You know, I thought it meant something like, hey, let's watch the recruits work themselves to death while we sit back and watch with glee. Anyway, so that's not what it means. Pootajacks, again, is an acronym. And it's actually spelled out P-D-U-A. I had spelled it P-U-D-A. So the correct spelling is P-D-U-A, which really has nothing to do with public displays of affection, because that would be something different. But what it means is physical drill under arms. What? Physical drill? Well, son of a bitch, that's like the most polite phrase for what they did to us, or what we made ourselves do to ourselves because they told us to do it, or we'd be out. Before I close out here and we get on to your regular scheduled programming, WHEC 41 also sort of confirmed my general sense and experience of Pootajacks. And his comment, and I'm going to quote him here, and my apologies, because I'm sure I'm not going to sound like you, but his comment said, and I quote, "and was easily the most grueling hour of my 8 weeks there," end quote. Now, I don't know WHEC 41, but he and I and a ton of other coasties who went through Cape May, New Jersey, and I'm probably sure other services share the same experience, but we're only talking about coasties here, right? But that is one thing that we all have experienced at one point or another, were Pootajacks. So to WHC 41 of November 76, thank you, good sir, and I wish you fair winds and following seas. Hot, sweaty bodies all over the place, drinking. There are people throwing up in the streets because they were drinking. And occasionally you'd find some dumbass guy or a girl peeing in the street.
Gonzo, the Coast Guard ears. Key West, Episode 2. Duval Street in the sunset.
After I'd been left to my own devices, my roommates eventually made their way back to the room. Rob Diamond and Dave Trombone eventually came back to join me. Now, Rob was a really, 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 really nice guy. He was probably the nicest one to me my entire time in Key West, Florida. I mean, I didn't hang out with him that much, but he was definitely, I don't think I ever met a nicer guy in the Coast Guard than Rob Diamond. Dave Trombone, on the other hand, he was sort of a different kind of person. When Dave would walk into a room, he always looked confused. It's like he walked into our room and was like, oh, a complete stranger. And the look on confusion on his face was priceless. I remember the first time that I saw Dave. So I was sitting in our room, and I think I was watching TV, or I don't know, maybe I was doing something, but Dave walks in, and I turn around to look at the door, and this wave of heat comes in too, by the way, because it's really freaking hot and humid out there. But the humidity actually wasn't too bad. But anyway, Dave walks in and he blurts out, "Who are you?" I'm like, "Hi, Tim. Just got here, right out of boot camp." Dave went from this confused look immediately to Mr. Tough Guy mode. He just sort of like starts talking about, "What? I got stuck with a boot as a roommate?" And I remember smiling back at him, sort of apologizing, like, "Yeah, hey, sorry, dude, you're stuck with me for a while." Dave started asking a whole bunch of questions about, when I got out of boot camp, and what was my nationality and what would I be doing. I was able to answer everything except for what I'd be doing. I sort of just told them, they just told me to come here, and this is my room, and that I would have to go down to the barracks lobby to get my assignment. That's pretty much all that I knew. I mean, I knew sort of kind of what the Coast Guard did by now, at least from what I learned in boot camp. I mean, the Coast Guard did search and rescue. They did maritime law enforcement, which included going after drug smugglers, which is sort of what I kind of wanted to do. I was hoping to be like those dudes from Miami Vice, Sonny Crockett and Ricardo Tubbs. If you don't know what Miami Vice was, it was a TV show back in the mid-late 80s. And that's all I'm going to tell you about it. Look it up. I think I mentioned previously that Dave is of Portuguese descent from Rhode Island. He was always loud, but he was basically a good guy overall. I mean, he was really nice too. He was nice when nobody else was in the room, but then when his shipmates showed up, or some other guy in the Coast Guard showed up, he turned into Mr. Tough Guy. It was kind of embarrassing how he did it, but Dave wasn't I don't think he was ever a stellar coastie. I think he just sort of was always in a state of confusion, and he got picked on a lot by the guys on his ship, because I think he was actually the most junior guy on his ship as far as seniority. Dave was actually assigned to one of the Coast Guard black hull boats. I mean, it was a new black hull boat. They were called surface effect ships, or SES for short. The SESs were fairly new in the U.S. Coast Guard. I don't think they came into service until sometime in the mid to late 80s. There were 3 of them that were stationed in Key West, and they were predominantly focused on the interdiction of narcotics. Interesting little factoid about that. It wasn't since Prohibition, the time when they outlawed alcohol in general. But before then, the Coast Guard didn't have any ships or cutters that were designed specifically for law enforcement until the SESs showed up. So it was kind of cool. Dave was attached to the 3rd ship in this line of SESs. It was the SES-3, or U.S. Coast Guard Surface Effect Ship 3, Shearwater. So Shearwater was the name of the boat or ship. Now, what made these ships kind of cool was not only were they law enforcement ships, but they had these giant airlift fans under them. And so when the fans got activated, the boat would rise up a little bit out of the water, and it essentially rode on these rails pretty much like a catamaran. I mean, they had these aluminum sidewalls that came down along the side, and that, sort of would glide through the water, and again, like a catamaran. They were kind of cool, but apparently they weren't cool enough, or maybe there were just lots of maintenance problems with them, or they were too costly to maintain, because sometime on or about January 1994, those 3 SES ships were decommissioned and taken out of service in the Coast Guard. Now, at some point, Rob Diamond eventually made his way to the room, like I said earlier, but then things sort of get a little foggy, at least as far as my recollection. I think in time for the evening meal, I don't know if I went with Rob or I went with Rubiano. But what I do remember is that Rubiano and I, after dinner, he decided he wanted to show me around Key West, Florida, and, in something off the base, because that was really the coolest part about being in Key West, Florida, was that you were on an island and you got to check out Key West, Florida. So Rubiano and I, walked down the steps from my barracks room, and we headed out toward the back gate. And the back gate was actually guarded by a couple of Navy personnel who were carrying .45 pistols on their hips, and occasionally you'd see a guy with an M16. They were guarding the back gate because that's what you do. You guard the gates on a military base. But right next to that back gate, on the military side of the gate, the Navy had these ships. I think there's a total of 6 of them, but I don't think I ever saw more than like 2 or 3 there at the same time. That's not true. Later on, I saw all of them. But they were called Femrons. Now, Femrons were really, really, really cool. And I'll talk more about them a little bit later on. But so they were there guarding the back gate, but they were also making sure nobody got too close to those Femrons. So we squeeze past the Navy dudes. We go out through the gate, and immediately off to our right, you see these commercial fishing boats. Or that was sort of my recollection. There were some commercial fishing boats off to my right, and because that's exactly how close we were to the water. I mean, it was like right there. The part of Key West, just outside the base, it always seemed really sketchy considering how close it was to the actual Navy/Coast Guard base. Anyway, these commercial fishing boats, not only were they sketchy looking, but they just looked like shit. They had rust all over them. They were dirty. But these are the boats that went out and caught the seafood that was served pretty much daily on Key West, Florida. And I don't know, maybe they went to other parts of the Florida Keys. I don't know. So as Rubiano and I are walking down the road, the sketchy road, we actually come across another road. I think it was called Carolyn Street. Now, the significant thing about Carolyn Street is that was sort of like the main road that took you to the world famous Turtle Crawls. Now, Turtle Crawls was a bar/restaurant, but what it was known for at the time in 1987 was that it had 50 beers from around the world. And I didn't know they actually had 50 beers on the different types of beers on the planet. But apparently, there's a whole bunch from different countries that Turtle Crawls had. And if you drank all of them, obviously not in one setting, but over a period of time, I think you got a T-shirt, and you got to write your name somewhere, like on the walls or the ceilings or someplace inside of Turtle Crawls. Got to write your name, so it was like a big deal. I didn't go to Turtle Crawls all that often. I was 19 and drinking age was 21, and I never actually drank 50 different types of beers. As a matter of fact, I don't think even in my lifetime, even to this point, I've had 50 different types of beers. Probably close, but anyway, we didn't stop there, but he sort of pointed out that that's where it was. And we made our way down the rest of the way until we came to Duval Street. Now, Duval Street it's like the main drag through Key West, Florida, as far as nightlife is concerned. I mean, it's world famous. at least world famous if you know about Key West, Florida, because I didn't know anything about Key West until I got there. Now, the only way to really describe Duval Street, it's sort of a weird, eclectic mix of people. There were locals, tourists who were mostly normal, sort of weird, or mostly weird, and just some downright odd stuff going on. I mean, along Duval Street, there were just tons of bars and some restaurants, but those restaurants were really just pretending to be restaurants. They were actually just a disguise for some more bars. Kind of one of the cool features of Duval Street was that most of the buildings were 3 stories tall, and each level tended to have a different type of bar or a different themed bar. I don't know if they were like the same owners with just different themed bars, but anyway, I always thought that was kind of cool. Anyway, as I mentioned before, Key West, Florida is hot during most of the year. And with all of the drinking that goes on Duval Street, some things tend to, become sort of the norm. There are hot, sweaty bodies all over the place, drinking. There are people throwing up in the streets because they were drinking. And occasionally you'd find some dumbass guy or a girl peeing in the street. Or sometimes there was a homeless person, which weren't really too many on Duval Street. They did a good job of either hiding them from the public, or they just had just a low number of homeless people in Key West. But regardless, there's always this weird smell there. You do get used to it, but it's a combination of hot, sweaty people and urine and seafood and alcohol and mostly beer. Running around there. But for me, a 19-year-old kid from Fauquier County in Virginia, none of that was actually particularly interesting or noteworthy. But what was noteworthy and mostly shocking to someone like me, at least from my exposure to the world, let me put it that way, from what I was exposed to, the most shocking thing to me was this place called the Copa. The Copa was a nightclub. You're thinking, well, why is that shocking? Well, it wasn't that the Copa itself from externally was shocking, though I do think that the Copa might have been named after that Barry Manilow song, the song called Copacabana. I'm not a fan of Barry Manilow, though I do know who Barry Manilow is. And I only know who Barry Manilow is because of my mother. My mother loves Barry Manilow. At least she used to. And I can sort of remember her playing those big 33 vinyl albums in the house. Anyway. Now I got that song in my head, but trust me, for your sake and my sanity, I am not going to try to sing it. But what made the Copa so shocking? Well, along the 600 block of historic Duval, one of the things that immediately catches your eye about the Copa during this time in December of 1987, there was sort of a small in stature guy, and by that I mean he was probably like 5'6", 5'7", not a tall dude, and sort of a slight build. But he wore an all-white suit from like head to toe, white shoes, white pants, a white sports jacket with I think he had like a white tuxedo shirt underneath it. And he kind of looked like he just walked off of an episode of Fantasy Island. Like he could have been like Tattoo to Mr. Rourke. I mean, he was taller. And he also had these they look like crochet needles, like sticking through his hair on the back of his head. I had no idea what the hell that was for. I mean, it just looked weird. But then again, this is Key West, Florida, so it was probably normal. Standing kind of close to him, but not too close, was a big dude. He was clearly a bodybuilder or bouncer type person. And I'm pretty sure that's what he was. He was a bouncer. And he was also wearing a white tuxedo shirt with a bow tie. And I think he had on black slacks or something. But he was definitely sort of a mountain of a man. So I think the smaller guy, I think his job was to be the hype man, or I think the technical term is he was out there barking. I didn't make up that term, okay? I heard about it somewhere, but essentially this dude's job was to get people to come into his nightclub. And again, the thing about this particular nightclub is that it was the first time I had heard of, this just sounds a little crazy, especially nowadays. It was the first nightclub that I heard of that was devoted to, well, it was a gay nightclub, folks. I mean, what can I say? I was trying to find some elegant way to say it without sounding like a complete jackass. But yeah, it was the first gay nightclub I'd ever heard of. I'm sure it was not the only gay nightclub, around, but it's, again, I was from Fauquier County. I didn't know anything about anything. But anyway, so that was shocking for me. I never went inside of the Copa. Rubiano had told me that the Copa was off limits to all Coast Guard personnel, and he was pretty sure also that included all military personnel in general, like the Navy guys who also lived in Key West, Florida. I don't think I ever heard any official word that it was off limits, but I just can't imagine that Rubiano would make any of that up. On an occasion or two, when you walked in front of the Copa on a late evening, you could just barely hear some music that was coming out of it. It was really faint, but it was definitely dance music. You couldn't, like I said, you couldn't see anything because the glasses were all, blacked out and stuff, but you can definitely hear it was dance music. So there was some credence to the fact that it was a nightclub. That's all I know about that. Fast forward to August of 1995. The Copa had caught on fire, and some of the surrounding buildings also caught on fire. And so the Copa is no longer there. Something else did replace it. Another type of nightclub replaced it. And the last time I was in Key West, Florida was back in February of 2007. The blacked out doors were gone, and you could see into the nightclub. And when I was there wasn't a lot of people. Again, I was there in February, so not a lot of tourists are out and about. I was probably there during the early part of the week, too, so people definitely aren't out. Statistically, there's fewer people out during the week. But they made it clear that, everyone was welcome. But anyway, another interesting thing on Duval Street was a head shop. And essentially a head shop, at least back in 1987, was a place where you could buy, drug paraphernalia, things like bongs and bowls and whatnot. But they also sold these cool white T-shirts. And by cool, I mean they weren't cool if you were some military, high muckety-muck or one of those uptight people. The shirt said on it, I think it was U.S. Coast Guard Water Nazis, or maybe it was Water Nazis, the U.S. Coast Guard. Clearly the proprietors of that place were not fans of the Coast Guard. Imagine. As we're walking, it wasn't clear to me exactly where we were going. I do know we ended up at a place called Mallory Square. Now, Mallory Square in itself is kind of an interesting place. There were literally people everywhere. There were different types of people that were there. There were street performers, people selling souvenirs. I mean, they looked more like stuff that you'd find at a flea market, or maybe something stashed away like in your grandmother's closet or basement. But it was here at Mallory Square. It's where I learned about the world famous Key West Sunset Celebration. Now, when I think of celebration, it's usually something that doesn't happen all the time. That's why you celebrate it, because it doesn't happen all the time. But in Key West, so far as I know, the sun was setting every damn day, right? I mean, if it wasn't, we'd have some bigger problems going on. But almost every night, or every night that I know of, they had their Key West sunset celebration. What that really meant, I think, was just an excuse for people to go to Mallory Square, and they promoted lots of alcohol. I mean, people drank all the time, mostly tourists, of course. But I'm not even sure that it was just the tourists that indulged in the sunset celebration. I have to imagine locals did too, and that because mostly it was the locals that were working down there, supporting all of the tourist needs. And you're outside, so you're going to see the sunset celebration. Maybe you don't pay attention to it. I don't know. I mean, I didn't want to be a tourist. You know how it is when you're new to an area and you want to blend in. You didn't want to be a tourist, but the locals knew that you essentially didn't belong there. You were a tourist. I don't know how they knew, but you just stick out, right? So if you get to Mallory Square, there's always something there that can occupy you. And whether it's, watching the street performer shows, it always seems like no matter how many times I went there over the span of a number of years, there was always some fire breather. And there was a southernmost fire breather or southernmost fire dancer or southernmost juggler or something like that. But at some point, you have to wonder what was so special about these Key West sunsets. I mean, other than the fact that apparently it was the last place on the East Coast, I think, that you could see the sunset. That was kind of significant. But what was also kind of interesting about a Key West sunset is that if you were there during sunset, I think I'm saying sunset too many times here, but there was this thing called the mythical green flash at sunset. I suppose it's supposed to be sort of like the Key West version of the Northern Lights, except you're in Key West, not up north, and it's a sunset or a flash, not a light. The thing about this, it was rumored, and I say rumored because I actually never saw it myself, nor do I know anybody that actually saw it. If you were looking out at the sunset as the sun was starting to, dip below the horizon, at some point, you'd see a green flash. Now, of course, the atmospheric conditions needed to be just so, and you needed to keep your eyes open just so, don't blink, and stuff like that. So on December 14th, 1987, around 5:40 p.m. is when sunset was. I remember just before this whole moment was happening, everyone sort of looks out across the Gulf or towards the Gulf. It got really quiet enough. I mean, quieter than it was. And people started watching the sun, sink below the horizon. It was kind of cool. I mean, it was my first sunset I'd ever seen over the Gulf, my first sunset that I saw in Key West, Florida. So it was kind of nifty, and people are watching and stuff. And when it was all over with, there was no green flash. All right, whatever. At that point, people sort of stared out a little bit and oohed and ahed, and they talked about how lovely it was and all that kind of cool, romantic sort of stuff. Rubiano and I just turned around and walked away, and we started heading back toward the base. But along the way, Rubiano took me over to this seawall where we just sort of sat down and let our legs dangle over the edge. We kind of sat there and we talked for a little bit. Rubiano was rambling on about different things and people, and he kept saying, I don't want to say too much. I'll let you see for yourself. But yet he kept on talking about the same sort of thing. It was my impression that his soon-to-be departure from the U.S. Coast Guard was starting to get to him. I think when he was getting out, he was going to go back to Miami. I think that's where he and his family were from, or his family was at that time. But I don't know. I don't remember. But he kept on talking. And it's all good, right? I mean, I'll admit that sort of hanging out on that seawall and just chit-chatting away, and although the sun was officially down, there's still plenty of light. to see. But it was a bit of a weird, surreal moment. Looking out over the Gulf, seeing the ocean, it had occurred to me at that point that I had not had that much freedom, like ever. That is the most freedom I'd ever had in one day. Which isn't to say that for the next several years, there wasn't going to be people telling me what to do. But for a 19-year-old kid who just 10 weeks ago was living at home and just, still living the life of a teenager with his parents, I had officially moved away and living in Key West, Florida. I mean, it's not that I hadn't been away from my family that long. I mean, shit, I spent 8 weeks in boot camp getting my ass handed to me almost every day. But now I'm 19. I'm over 1,200 miles from where I grew up. I'm officially living in Key West, Florida. I'm totally fucking scared about what's happening next. But at the same time, I'm pretty damn happy about it. It's kind of cool. It was all really cool. Eventually, Rubiano and I made it back to the gate. We showed the dudes our military IDs. The Navy pukes let us in. We get back to the barracks. And it was at that point Rubiano walked me back to my room. I wasn't sure he was checking to make sure I didn't get lost, or perhaps he just was sort of milking it to make sure he still had someone to talk to, because he was going back to his room, and I don't know if he had a roommate or he was by himself. But either way, I'm pretty sure he didn't want to be alone. When I got back to the room, I remember sort of sitting there and chit-chatting with Rob Diamond a little bit. And he just kind of, was welcoming me to the Coast Guard and sort of telling me a bunch of stuff and a little bit about the base. He, too, was also assigned to the barracks as well. And he did mention that, we needed to be there by 7:30. He usually got there a little earlier. And so anyway, we didn't really talk a whole lot because it just finished getting settled in and went to bed. Anyway, I'll admit, I was pretty pooped. I mean, it was a long day. I'd been up probably around 3:30 that morning. And so, yeah, I was pretty wrecked. Anyway, pooped. Speaking of poop, not referring back to season 1, episode 1, but I'm talking about Dave. Now, again, I mentioned Dave was really a nice guy, but he had no shame, or rather he had no boundaries, and or very few boundaries. But I'll tell you more about that later, because some of that stuff was like, I was not getting used to that.
You've been listening to Gonzo the Coast Guardiers Key West, written and produced by Tim Gonzalez, and I'm Nicholas Gonzalez, the voice guy. Join us next week for another episode of Gonzo the Coast Guardiers.